A celestial and bold 30-year-old CEO, Nova Blackwood, finds herself hunted by a ghost. Her grandfather, Sterling Blackwood, has issued a final ultimatum from beyond the grave. Marry within 30 days or watch her multi-billion-dollar tech empire be fed to a predatory board. This isn't a fairy tale, and Nova isn't looking for a prince. She's looking for a logistic solution. She needs a man who can play a part, sign an ironclad contract, and vanish into the shadows once the ink is dry. It's a high-stakes game of corporate chess where love is the only losing move. The scene is set 40 floors above the city, where the floor-to-ceiling glass of the executive suite barely muffles the storm brewing in Nova's mind. Clad in a charcoal gray power suit with mahogany skin glowing under the recessed lights, she stares at the crisis envelope, a cream-colored death warrant for her career. The oxygen in the room suddenly thins when Jax Sun walks in. He doesn't move like a hired applicant. He moves like water flowing through a crack in a dam. Silent, inevitable, and terrifyingly dangerous. The moment his predatory gaze locks onto hers, the message to the audience is clear. The Invincible Queen has just invited a wolf into her glass tower, and she is no longer the most dangerous person in the room. The air on the 40th floor of the Blackwood Tower was thin, filtered, and smelled of expensive bergamot and cold ambition. Nova Blackwood stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her mahogany skin glowing against the charcoal gray of her power suit. Below, the city was a grid of ants, but inside this office, she was the only thing that mattered. She adjusted a silver drop earring, her reflection revealing a woman who looked invincible, even as she held the cream-colored envelope that threatened to shatter her world. Sterling Blackwood had always been a man of precision, and even from the grave, his polished, wealthy shadow loomed over her, demanding a husband as the price for her empire. "The next candidate is here, Ms. Blackwood," Shun's voice crackled over the intercom. Nova didn't turn around. "Send him in, and tell him he has exactly 60 seconds to prove he isn't a waste of my time." She had already rejected a dozen men, actors, disgraced lawyers, and social climbers who smelled of desperation. They had all flinched under her gaze. They had all blinked. Nova didn't need a partner. She needed a logistic solution, a ghost she could dress in silk and parade before a predatory board. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Usually, she could hear a man's nerves in the scuff of his shoes or the catch in his breath. This time, there was only silence. A heavy, intentional stillness settled into the room, shifting the oxygen until the hair on the back of Nova's neck stood up. She finally turned, her vintage-inspired waves catching the light as she faced the man standing in the center of her fortress. He wasn't what she expected. He wore a crisp black dress shirt, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, but he didn't carry the practiced submissiveness of the others. Jax Sun stood with a fluid, predatory grace, his sharp features and perfectly groomed undercut giving him the look of a man who was more comfortable in a dark alley than a boardroom. His gaze wasn't just intense, it was a physical weight. "You're late," Nova said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "I was admiring the security," Jax replied. His voice was a low baritone that implied heat and danger, vibrating in the small space between them. "It's high-end, but there's a blind spot in the north elevator bank. Someone could slip through like water through a crack in a dam if they knew what they were looking for." Nova narrowed her eyes. That was the exact analogy she had used to describe the man she needed, someone inevitable and invisible. She walked toward him, her heels clicking a rhythmic warning on the marble. She stopped inches from his chest, looking up into eyes that didn't move, didn't soften, and most importantly, didn't blink. "You know the terms?" she asked, testing the air. "A 30-day contract. A legal fiction. You will be my fiancé in public and a ghost in private. You sign the non-disclosure, you take the payment, and you vanish the moment I secure my shares." Jax looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at her empire or the luxury of the office. He looked at her, as if he were calculating the exact strength of her armor. There was a stillness about him that was unnerving, a sense that the man in the suit was merely a mask for something far more lethal. "I don't care about your money, Ms. Blackwood," he said softly, the edge of a tattoo peeking from beneath his cuff as he moved. But I find your predicament interesting. You want a wolf to guard your tower. Are you sure you're ready to let one in? The defiance in his tone should have offended her, but it did the opposite. It sparked. For the first time in weeks, Nova felt a surge of the main character energy that had built this company. She saw the red X on the contract in her mind, the symbol of a deal that was a beautiful, necessary lie. I don't hire people I can't handle, Mr. Sun, she countered, her celestial brightness clashing with his shadowed intensity. Then we have a deal, Jax said. He reached out, not to shake her hand, but to pick up the fountain pen resting on her desk. He signed the contract with a swift, jagged motion. Nova watched him, a strange realization settling in her chest. She had set out to find a prop, a man she could control like a line of code. But as Jax Sun handed her the pen, his predatory gaze never leaving hers, she realized the board members were no longer her biggest problem. She had saved her empire from her grandfather's ghost, but she had just invited a living, breathing danger into the heart of her world. Welcome to the Blackwood legacy, Jax, she whispered. He didn't smile. He just stepped back into the shadows of the doorway. Try not to regret it, Nova. Jax Sun stepped out of the Blackwood tower and into the biting evening air, the crisp weight of the signed contract in his inner pocket feeling like a loaded weapon. To the world, he was now the logistic solution for a desperate billionaire. But as he moved through the crowded sidewalk with a fluid, predator's grace, the suit felt like a skin he was itching to shed. He didn't head for a luxury car. Instead, he disappeared into a narrow, neon-lit alleyway 3 blocks away where a matte black motorcycle waited in the shadows. He pulled a rugged leather jacket over his dress shirt, the heavy hide concealing the ink that marked his skin and his soul. Jax wasn't a consultant, and he certainly wasn't for sale. As the head of a silent, lethal syndicate that moved through the city's marrow, he had more money than Nova Blackwood could count. He hadn't stood in that office to save her empire. He was there because Nova was the only key to a door that had been locked for 5 years. The engine roared to life, a low, guttural snarl that mirrored the heat beneath his calm exterior. 5 years ago, the only person who had ever seen past his armor, a woman who knew him before the syndicate, before the blood, had vanished. She had been swallowed by the elite social circles of the Blackwoods, a world protected by firewalls and NDAs that even the most talented hackers couldn't breach. By becoming Nova's fake husband, Jax wasn't just entering a marriage. He was infiltrating a fortress. He arrived at a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the docks, the headquarters of his operations. Inside, the consultant mask dropped entirely. His second-in-command, Shun, looked up from a bank of monitors, his expression grim. "You're in?" Shun asked, his voice echoing in the vast, industrial space. "The contract is signed," Jax replied, tossing his keys onto a metal table. He walked over to a digital board covered in encrypted files and grainy surveillance photos. In the center was a blurred image of a woman at a Blackwood charity gala from years ago. Nova is bold, but she's arrogant. She thinks she's the one pulling the strings. She has no idea she just handed the most dangerous man in the city a front-row seat to her grandfather's inner circle. Jax leaned in, his angular features sharpened by the harsh glow of the screens. His heart, usually a cold, mechanical thing, gave a dull thud of old pain. He wasn't looking for a salary or a corporate title. He was looking for a ghost. For 5 years, he had lived in the shadows, building a kingdom of fear just to have the resources to find her. Now, the path led straight through the Blackwood legacy. "The board meeting is in 3 days, Shun noted. "If the syndicate is spotted near her, the whole thing burns." "Then we don't get spotted," Jax said, his predatory gaze fixed on the digital board. "Nova wants a wolf to guard her tower? Fine. I'll play the part. I'll wear the silk ties and smile for the cameras. But the second I find what I'm looking for, the contract ends." He thought back to the way Nova had looked at him in the office, defiant, celestial, and utterly convinced she was in control. She was a lioness, but she was playing a game she didn't understand. Jax felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but a dark sort of curiosity. He was using her, just as she was using him. The handshake they had shared was a lie, a collision of her glass world and his violent one. Jax pulled a burner phone from his pocket and sent a single, encrypted message to his lieutenants. Phase 1 complete. The Trojan horse is inside the tower. As he looked back at the image of the woman he had lost, Jax's jaw tightened. He had been warned that seeking revenge or lost loves in the world of the Blackwoods was a suicide mission. But Jax Sun didn't fear the fall. He had already lived in the dark for so long that the light of Nova's world didn't blind him. It only made his targets easier to see. The contract is a lie wasn't just a catchy phrase for a thumbnail. It was the foundation of his survival. He was the wolf in the lobby, and the hunt had officially begun. The following morning, Nova Blackwood decided that if Jax Sun was to be her shield, he first had to be her masterpiece. She brought him to an atelier tucked away in a cobblestone corner of the city, a place where the world's elite paid thousands for the illusion of perfection. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wool and steam. Nova stood with her arms crossed, her charcoal gray suit sharp enough to draw blood, as she watched the master tailor circle Jax like a vulture. "He's too solid," the tailor muttered, hovering a measuring tape over Jax's shoulders. "The silhouette is fighting the fabric." Nova stepped forward, her silver earrings catching the light as she tilted her head. "Then make the fabric submit. He needs to look like he was born into money, not like he's wearing it for the first time. I want the charcoal silk blend. It needs to hide the man and show the gentleman." Jax stood on the pedestal, his expression a mask of bored indifference, but his eyes were far from quiet. They tracked Nova's every movement with a predatory focus that made the small shop feel claustrophobic. When the tailor reached to unbutton Jax's black shirt to check the collar fit, Jax's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist in a grip that made the tailor gasp. "I'll do it," Jax said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the room. Nova felt the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden thinning of oxygen she had experienced in her office. "Is there a problem, Jax? This is part of the contract. You are a logistic solution, remember? And right now, your logistics require a better fit." Jax didn't look at the tailor. He looked directly at Nova. With a slow, deliberate movement, he began to undo the buttons himself. As the dark fabric parted, Nova's breath hitched. Beneath the crisp cotton, the consultant vanished. Rising from his chest and disappearing under his sleeves were the intricate, dark lines of tattoos, jagged, artistic, and violent. They were the markings of a life lived in the dirt and the dark, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the atelier. "You're staring, Ms. Blackwood," Jax noted, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "Is the accessory not to your liking?" Nova forced herself to maintain her composure, though the main character energy she usually wielded felt suddenly dampened by a raw, unscripted heat. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from the ink on his collarbone. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The shattered glass metaphor felt more real than ever. The armor she had built around her heart was beginning to show spiderweb cracks. "It's unconventional," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "But a Blackwood doesn't hide who they are. We simply make sure the world sees only what we want them to see. Cover them. The board won't understand a man who carries his history on his skin." Jax stepped off the pedestal, closing the distance between them until Nova had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of him, leather, cedar, and something metallic, swirled around her. "You're so obsessed with the image, Nova. But you forget that even a wolf in a silk suit still has teeth. Are you trying to mold me? Or are you just trying to convince yourself that you're still the one in control?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to the tailor, who was trembling slightly, and held out his arms. "The charcoal silk. And make it fast. We have an empire to save, don't we?" Nova watched him, her eyes tracing the way the light caught the angular planes of his face. She had expected friction, but she hadn't expected this magnetic pull that felt less like a business arrangement and more like a collision. As the tailor began to pin the expensive fabric over Jax's tattooed skin, Nova realized the contract is a lie, was becoming a double-edged sword. She was molding him into the perfect husband, but in the process, she was letting the heat of Jax Sun melt the very ice that kept her safe. The tension in the room was a living thing, a spark of raw attraction that threatened to burn down the tower before they even reached the board meeting. Nova turned away, staring at her reflection in the three-way mirror, but all she could see was Jax's predatory gaze reflected back at her, waiting for the moment the glass finally shattered. The privacy partition of the Maybach clicked shut, sealing Nova and Jax into a world of leather, ambient blue light, and suffocating proximity. Outside, the city blurred into a smear of neon, but inside, the air was heavy with the unresolved friction from the atelier. Nova sat as far as the seat would allow, her hands clasped tightly over her knees, the charcoal silk of her suit feeling like an iron cage. "You're doing it again," Jax said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the seat and into her bones. He wasn't sitting like a hired consultant. He was sprawled with a casual, predatory ease that made the luxury vehicle feel like his personal lair. Nova didn't look at him. Doing what? Being a statue. If we walk into that engagement party tomorrow and you're this rigid, the board won't see a woman in love. They'll see a woman in a hostage situation. I am a Blackwood, Nova snapped, finally turning her head. Her mahogany skin was luminous in the dim light, but her eyes were guarded. I don't do soft. I do business. This is a transaction, Jax. I hired you to stand there and look the part, not to critique my personality. Jax didn't flinch. Instead, he moved. It wasn't a fast motion, but it was inevitable, like a predator closing a gap. Before Nova could protest, he was in her space, his hand coming up to rest on the leather headrest behind her ear. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a physical force. Business is about leverage, Nova, he whispered, his sharp features inches from hers. And right now, you have no leverage over your own emotions. You're too stiff. You're holding your breath as if you're afraid the air will burn you. I'm fine, she lied, her pulse hammering against the base of her throat. Look at me, he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of the man who ran the syndicate, the man who knew how to make a city tremble. Not like I'm an employee. Not like I'm a line on a spreadsheet. I need you to look at me with gravitation. Nova's brow furrowed. With what? Gravitation. The way a planet looks at the sun, it can't escape. There has to be a pull, Nova. A hunger. If you want them to believe the contract is real, you have to make them believe that even if the world ended tonight, the only place you'd want to be is right here. He reached out then, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. His touch was rougher than she expected, calloused and warm. The celestial composure she spent years building began to melt. Jax leaned in closer, his dark gaze locking onto hers with such intensity that the rest of the world, the board, the grandfather, the empire, simply ceased to exist. For a heartbeat, the acting stopped. The line between the bold CEO and the dangerous mafia king blurred into something raw and unrecognizable. Nova felt the gravitation he spoke of, a terrifying, magnetic lure that pulled her toward his shadowed world. Her eyes dropped to his lips, then back to his predatory gaze. She wasn't acting anymore. She was reacting to the wolf she had invited into her home. Better, Jax murmured, his thumb lingering on her skin. Keep that look. When we walk in there, I want every man in the room to hate me because they think I've seen the part of you that you keep under lock and key. He pulled back, just as the limo slowed to a crawl in the evening traffic. The spell broke, but the heat remained. Nova turned back to the window, her reflection showing a woman whose invincibility was being traded for something far more dangerous, a heartbeat she could no longer control. I thought I hired a husband, Nova said, her voice barely a whisper. You hired a solution, Jax replied, his gaze returning to the city lights as if the moment of intimacy had never happened. Just make sure you can handle the side effects. The ballroom of the Blackwood estate was a cathedral of excess, dripping in crystal chandeliers and the hushed, treacherous whispers of the city's elite. Nova Blackwood glided through the crowd like a celestial queen, her charcoal gray gown shimmering with every step, but her hand was locked firmly in the crook of Jax Sun's arm. He was a revelation in his tailored suit, the silk blend fabric expertly masking the ink on his skin, though it could do nothing to hide the predatory stillness that set him apart from the tuxedoed peacocks surrounding them. "Smile, Nova," Jax murmured, his lips barely moving as he greeted a passing senator. "You look like you're walking to the gallows, not your engagement party." "I'm calculating the net worth of every person in this room who wants to see me fail," Nova replied, her voice a sharp, elegant whisper. "It's a long list." At the top of that list was Steve. He stood near the champagne fountain, surrounded by a cluster of board members, looking every bit the corporate shark in his shimmering silver suit. As Nova and Jax approached, the air around the group chilled. Steve had spent years trying to dismantle Nova's authority, and tonight, his eyes were bright with the prospect of blood in the water. "Nova, darling," Steve drawled, his voice carrying just far enough to turn heads. "The board was beginning to think you'd invented this mystery man to save your shares. And here he is. Though, I must say, I expected someone with a bit more pedigree." Nova tightened her grip on Jax's arm, her jaw set. "Steve, I believe you haven't met my fiancé, Jax Sunday. He doesn't care much for pedigrees. He prefers results." Steve didn't even look at Nova. His gaze raked over Jax with visible disdain, lingering on the way Jax's broad shoulders seemed to strain against the fine fabric. "He's a handsome specimen, I'll give you that. But tell me, Mr. Sun, which clearance rack did Nova find you on? Or was it a fire sale for consultants with no last names?" The circle of socialites tittered. Nova felt a flash of white-hot protective rage, but before she could strike back with a verbal blade, she felt the man beside her shift. The logistic solution was gone. The wolf had arrived. Jax stepped forward, breaking the physical distance Steve had tried to use as a shield. He didn't look angry. He looked amused, which was infinitely more terrifying. He reached out, his hand moving with a fluid, terrifying speed, and grasped Steve's hand in what looked like a standard corporate greeting. "Steve, is it?" Jax asked, his voice low and smooth, like silk over a razor. "That's right," Steve sneered, trying to pull his hand back, but Jax's grip was an iron vice. Nova watched as the color began to drain from Steve's face. Jax wasn't just shaking his hand. He was applying a calculated, agonizing pressure to the small bones of the metacarpals. Steve's knees buckled slightly, his glass of champagne trembling as he fought not to cry out in front of the board. "I've spent a lot of time in places where men talk like you," Jax said, leaning in so close that only Steve and Nova could hear him. His eyes were dark, bottomless pits of heat and danger. They usually end up wishing they'd kept their mouths shut. "Nova is a queen. You're just a loud noise in a nice suit. If you insult her again, I won't just break your hand. I'll dismantle everything you think you own." Jax let go as abruptly as he had grabbed him. Steve stumbled back, cradling his hand against his chest, his eyes wide with a primal fear he hadn't felt in a decade. He looked at Nova, then at the man standing beside her, realizing for the first time that the prop husband had teeth. "Enjoy the party, Steve," Jax said, his smile never reaching his cold, predatory eyes. As they walked away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake, Nova felt a thrill of something dark and intoxicating. She looked up at Jax, seeing the hidden teeth he had promised. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the board or the man who had just defended her empire with a single, silent threat. "That wasn't in the contract," Nova whispered, her heart racing. "Consider it a bonus," Jax replied, the wolf slipping back behind the mask of the consultant. "Now, let's go find your grandfather's ghost and tell him the deal is done." The adrenaline of the gala still hummed in Nova's veins as the elevator doors chimed, opening into the cavernous silence of her triplex penthouse. The celestial queen of Blackwood Tower kicked off her silver heels, the sound of them hitting the marble floor echoing like distant gunshots. She felt the weight of the evening, the board's judging eyes, Steve's pathetic whimpering, and the strange, grounding presence of the man currently loosening his tie behind her. "The servers are still glitching," Nova muttered, walking toward her glass-walled study where a bank of monitors blinked in angry, rhythmic red. Ever since the engagement announcement, we've been hit with ping floods. If the internal security drops, the board will use it as proof that I'm distracted, that I've lost my grip. Jax Sun didn't ask for permission. He moved past her, his jacket already tossed onto a designer sofa, revealing the holster of his sharp wit and the shadowed ink on his forearms. You're looking at it like a CEO, Nova. You're looking at the symptoms. I look at the architecture. He dropped to the floor, pulling a hidden panel from the base of the server rack with a practiced ease that had nothing to do with corporate consulting. Nova watched him, mesmerized by the way his hands, the same hands that had nearly crushed Steve's bones, now danced over delicate fiber optic cables with surgical precision. The heat and danger he radiated was different now. It was focused, a low burn of competence that made the prop label feel like a joke. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, sliding down the wall to sit on the cool floor a few feet away. The charcoal gray gown pooled around her like a silken lake. "In places where a dead server meant a dead man," Jax replied without looking up. A line of code flickered across his face, highlighting the angular planes of his jaw. "Your grandfather built a fortress of glass, Nova. But he forgot that glass is transparent. You're being watched from the inside." He tapped a final command, and the frantic red blinking turned into a steady, rhythmic blue. The silence that followed was heavy, no longer tense with the threat of failure, but thick with something far more intimate. Nova realized, with a start, that she was sitting on the floor of her multi-million-dollar home, eating lukewarm Thai takeout from plastic containers with a man she was supposed to be using. "You saved me tonight," Nova said softly, opening a carton of noodles. "Not just the servers. Steve would have picked me apart in front of the directors." Jax finally looked at her. The predatory edge was still there, but it was tempered by the quiet of the midnight hour. He was a mosquito. "I don't like pests." He reached out, taking a spring roll, his gaze lingering on her face. "You're always so busy being the CEO, Nova. Don't you ever get tired of the costume?" Nova felt her mask slip, just an inch. The vintage waves of her hair had fallen loose, framing a face that was usually a study in invincibility, but now looked human, even vulnerable. "If I take it off, the empire falls. Sterling didn't leave me a company. He left me a war. This contract, it was supposed to be my final move. My checkmate. And now?" Jax asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bridge the gap between them on the floor. "And now I'm not sure who's playing whom," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment, the room felt smaller. The contract is a lie was still there, written in ink back at the office, but here, amidst the humming servers and the city lights, the lie felt like the only real thing in her life. Jax wasn't a prop anymore. He was a partner. He was the only person in the world who saw the cracks in the armor and didn't try to shatter them. Jax reached out, his thumb grazing her hand as they both reached for the last container. The contact sent a jolt of that gravitation through her, a pull so strong it made her breath catch. He didn't pull away. "The board meeting is in 48 hours, Jax said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. "After that, you get your empire back. You get your throne. And you vanish," Nova added, the thought suddenly feeling like a hollow victory. "That was the deal," he reminded her, though his eyes said something entirely different. As they sat in the blue glow of the restored servers, the Queen and the Mafia King shared a meal in the wreckage of their own pretenses. The penthouse felt less like a fortress and more like a home, and for the first time in her life, Nova Blackwood wasn't calculating her next 10 moves. She was simply existing in the heat of the wolf she had let into her tower. The boardroom of Blackwood Tower was a theater of cold light and high-backed leather chairs, a place where legacies were weighed in percentages and killed with the stroke of a pen. At the head of the long obsidian table sat Nova Blackwood, her mahogany skin contrasting sharply against the white silk blouse she wore beneath her power suit. She looked every bit the celestial queen, but beneath the table, her fingers were laced so tightly her knuckles were white. Beside her, Jax Sun sat with a stillness that felt like a coiled spring, his charcoal suit concealing the wolf that had spent the last month learning the scent of her enemies. The terms of the trust are clear, Ms. Blackwood. Silas leaned forward, his hand still wrapped in a discreet beige brace from his encounter with Jax at the Gala. The 30-day window has closed. Without a legitimate, vetted union, your voting shares revert to the board. And while we've seen your companion, the committee finds his background suspiciously thin. The directors nodded in a rhythmic, predatory consensus. They weren't looking for a marriage. They were looking for a corpse to strip of its assets. Nova felt the empire she had spent a decade building beginning to slip through her fingers. The background is thin because the records are private. Jax's voice cut through the room, low and vibrating with a frequency that made the water in the glass pitchers ripple. He didn't stand up. He didn't have to. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, and tossed a matte black tablet onto the obsidian table. But I think the committee will find these records far more substantial. The directors frowned, pulling the tablet toward them. As they scrolled, the color drained from Silas's face. These weren't marriage certificates or bank statements. They were leverage. Jax had spent the last 48 hours using his syndicate's reach to map the internal rot of every person in the room. He hadn't used corporate investigators. He had used the mafia-style negotiation that relied on knowing exactly which shadow a man was most afraid of. Director Miller, Jax said, his predatory gaze settling on a man at the far end of the table. I see your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are doing well. It would be a shame if the SEC received that specific ledger. And Silas, that merger you've been brokering with the rival firm behind Nova's back? The one that would be considered corporate espionage? I have the audio. It's quite clear. The room became a vacuum. The board members, men who had spent their lives playing God, suddenly looked like children caught in a fire. This wasn't a business negotiation. It was an execution. Jax wasn't playing by their rules because he didn't belong to their world. He was the heat and danger Nova had been warned about, now turned into a scorched earth defense of her throne. The marriage is legitimate, Jax concluded, his eyes never leaving Silas's. The contract is signed. Nova Blackwood remains the CEO with full voting power. Unless, of course, anyone here would like to discuss their personal liabilities in a more public forum. One by one, the directors lowered their heads. The motion to strip Nova of her shares wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. Silas looked at Nova, his eyes full of a new, trembling hatred, before he gathered his papers and led the retreat from the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Nova and Jax alone in the vast, silent boardroom. The sun was setting over the city, bathing the office in a deep, celestial orange. Nova stood up, her breath finally coming in a long, ragged exhale. She had won. The empire was hers. The ghost of Sterling Blackwood had been laid to rest, and her grandfather's archaic clause was dead. We did it, she whispered, looking out at the skyline. I kept it all, Jax. She turned to him, expecting to see the smirk of a victor, but Jax was already standing by the door, his silhouette dark against the light. The prop had finished his job. The victory felt strangely hollow, a cold triumph in an empty room. For a month, her life had been a whirlwind of high-stakes acting and midnight intimacy, and now, with the gavel fallen, the reality of their contract was the only thing left. You have your throne, Nova, Jax said, his voice flat, devoid of the heat that had sustained her through the battle. The board won't touch you again. You're safe. Jax, wait, she started, taking a step toward him. But the mask of the consultant was firmly back in place. He looked at her not as a partner, but as a client who had just received her final invoice. The gravitation that had pulled them together in the back of the limo felt like a distant dream. Nova realized with a sudden, sharp pang that in saving her empire, she had reached the end of the only thing that made her feel alive. I'll send the final documents to your legal team, Jax said, his hand on the door handle. Enjoy your empire, Miss Blackwood. You earned it. The following afternoon, the air in the executive suite felt heavy and stale, as if the victory from the day before had used up all the oxygen. Nova sat behind her mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as she slid a cream-colored envelope across the polished surface. This wasn't the one from her grandfather, it was her own. Inside was a check for $10 million, the final, cold payment for the man who had saved her world. Every instinct she possessed told her to run. The gravitation she felt toward Jax Sun was no longer a business risk. It was a threat to the very foundation of who she was. She was the invincible Nova Blackwood, and the way her heart thundered whenever Jax entered a room was a variable she couldn't control. To keep the empire, she had to excise the wolf. "Your final compensation," Nova said, her voice sounding brittle even to her own ears. She didn't look up, focusing instead on the silver drop earrings reflected in the glass tabletop. "I've added a bonus for the extra legal services you provided in the boardroom. The non-disclosure remains in effect indefinitely." Jax didn't pick up the envelope. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the room. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of terrifying, silent disappointment. He walked toward the desk with that fluid, predatory grace, but this time, the heat and danger felt like a freezing gale. "You're doing it again," Jax said softly, his voice a low rumble that made the silver pins on her desk vibrate. "You're trying to turn a human soul into a line item. You think if you pay me enough, you can pretend the last 30 days were just a series of transactions." "It was a transaction, Jax," Nova snapped, finally meeting his gaze. Her mahogany skin was pale with the effort of maintaining her composure. "We had a contract. I needed a husband, and I hired one. The job is done. I have my shares, you have your payout, and we both go back to our lives." Jax reached out, picking up the envelope with 2 fingers. For a fleeting second, Nova thought he would take it and leave, allowing her to crawl back into the safety of her glass fortress. Instead, he pulled the check out, looked at the staggering number of zeros, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then again, and again, the pieces of paper fluttered onto her desk like confetti at a funeral. "I told you the day we met that I didn't care about your money, Nova," Jax said, leaning over the desk until his sharp features were inches from hers. "But I thought, just for a second, that the woman who ate takeout on my floor and looked at me with gravitation was real. I thought she was brave enough to admit that she's lonely at the top." "I am not lonely," Nova whispered, her celestial mask cracking under the weight of his stare. "I am protected." "No," Jax countered, his voice dripping with a bitter, jagged truth. "You're just hiding. You've traded your heart for a title, and you've turned this entire tower into nothing more than an expensive, empty room. You're sitting on a throne of glass, Nova, and you're so terrified of a single scratch that you'd rather live in the dark than let anyone in." He straightened up, the wolf fully visible in the way he looked at her, not with hunger, but with pity. He didn't ask for a goodbye. He didn't wait for her to apologize. He simply turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. "Jax, wait!" Nova cried out, her hand reaching across the desk as if she could grab the air he left behind. He didn't stop. He didn't even look back. "Keep your empire, Ms. Blackwood. It's all you have left." The doors clicked shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. Nova sat in the sudden, crushing silence of her office. The torn scraps of a $10 million lie scattered across her mahogany desk. The city lights began to flicker on outside, but for the first time in her life, the view from the 40th floor felt desolate. She had her company. She had her legacy. But as she stared at the empty chair across from her, Nova realized that Jax was right. The tower was silent, the air was cold, and she was finally, utterly alone in the kingdom she had fought so hard to save. The silence of Blackwood Tower had become a suffocating weight. For 3 days, Nova sat in her ivory fortress, the invincible CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The glass walls she had spent a decade polishing now only reflected a woman who had won the war but lost her soul. She looked at the desk where the torn check had once lay, her eyes falling on the one thing Jax had left behind, a heavy, silver mechanical watch, its rhythmic ticking sounding like a heartbeat in the hollow room. Nova didn't call a driver. She didn't consult her board. She traded her charcoal gray power suit for a deep obsidian silk dress, draped a trench coat over her shoulders, and stepped out of the Blackwood legacy and into the cold, unpredictable night. The address Shun had provided led her far from the manicured streets of the financial district. She found herself in the industrial gut of the city, where neon signs flickered with a dying buzz and the air tasted of salt and exhaust. The gambling den was tucked behind a nondescript steel door, guarded by two men whose scars weren't hidden by expensive tailoring. They moved to block her path, but Nova didn't flinch. She met their gaze with the main character energy that had made her a titan, her mahogany skin glowing under the harsh streetlights. "Tell Jax Sun the lioness is here to return his property," she said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. The interior of the den was a world of smoke, low light, and the predatory stillness of men who lived by the blade. In the center of the room, seated at a high-stakes table, was Jax. He had shed the consultant mask entirely. He wore his rugged black leather jacket, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the full, violent beauty of the tattoos Nova had once tried to hide. He didn't look up as she approached, but the air in the room shifted, the gravitation returning with a force that made the floor feel unstable beneath her feet. "This is a dangerous place for a queen, Nova," Jax said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that cut through the noise of the room. He finally looked up, his predatory gaze locking onto hers. "There are no contracts here. No lawyers to protect you. Just risk." Nova walked to the table, the eyes of the underworld pressing in on her, and placed the silver watch on the green felt. "I'm not here for protection, Jax. And I'm certainly not here for a contract." The room went silent. Jax stood up, his height and presence dwarfing the men around him. He walked around the table, stopping just inches from her, the scent of leather and cedar filling her senses. "Then why are you here? You have your tower. You have your safety. I have an empty room," Nova whispered, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. She reached out, her fingers grazing the rough leather of his jacket before finding the warmth of his hand. "I spent my whole life trying to eliminate the variables, trying to make sure I could never be hurt. But I realized that a life without risk isn't a life. It's just an exit strategy." She looked up at him, her vintage waves falling loose, her celestial brightness finally meeting his shadowed intensity without a mask. "I don't want the security of a deal, Jax. I want the danger of you. I'm trading the glass tower for the risk of living." A slow, genuine smirk finally broke across Jax's sharp features. Not the smirk of a hired actor, but the grin of the wolf who had finally found his match. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with a possessive, raw heat. "You realize what this means?" Jax asked, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "If you walk out of here with me, the world you know will never be the same. The board, the legacy, they won't understand the queen and the syndicate king." "Let them watch," Nova replied, her eyes flashing with a bold, new fire. "I'm done playing by Sterling's rules. I'm playing by mine now." Jax didn't wait for her to finish. He pulled her into him, his kiss a collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. It was fierce, unscripted, and entirely without a termination clause. The lioness and the wolf had united, not by a document marked with a red X, but by a choice made in the dark. As they walked out of the den together, the city lights ahead didn't look like a grid of assets to be managed. They looked like a kingdom to be conquered.